Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Sandala. I'm Programming Outreach Specialist for LibraryLink NJ. I'm so happy to have you here for this conversation on Romance RA. Today with us, we have Romance RA expert, Robin Bradford, who is a collection development librarian for the Pierce County Library System in Washington State. She is also 2018 Library Journal Mover and Shaker, 2016 RWA Librarian of the Year, and she recently published the Reader's Advisory Guide to Romance from ALA Editions, which just came out a few weeks ago. Pick up a copy. Robin, we are so happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and always happy to talk about romance. And with that, let me give you a slideshow. All right, are we ready to go?
We are ready.
So I always start my presentations or name my presentations after a song. So today it's the Bee Gees, How Deep Is Your Love? But then I had to try to fit something library related in. So how deep is your love vocabulary? And if it's not very deep, then this presentation is for you. So when people talk about romance, you get all these different answers. And that's because romance has been used in the past to talk about periods of music, periods of literature, and periods of art. So you have romantic periods in all of those three major categories. So a lot of people will mix and match and try to fit romance genre into one of these definitions that they probably learned in school. And while that's great, it is not what we mean by romance. Romance novels, romance genre literature. These three are fantastic. I think I love all three of them, but not what we're talking about. So what is a romance? If we know what it's not, what is it? According to the RWA, which is the Romance Writers of America, there are two basic elements that comprise every romance novel: a central love story and an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending, more colloquially known as the HEA or the happily ever after. This hasn't always been the case. In fact, this definition is relatively recent, going back maybe 15 or so years. Before, it did not have to have an emotionally satisfying ending. It did, but it didn't have to. There were even times when people tried to put in, it has to be between one man and one woman. That didn't fly either. It was traditional, but there was a big pushback to say that's not what we want the official definition of our genre to be. And thank goodness for that. So now we've settled on a central love story and an emotionally and satisfying and optimistic ending, which means the story has to be about the main characters and their journey, and it has to end with them together. There's also the HFN, happy for now, which, they're happy at the end. It could continue and they could break up, they could find new partners, what have you, but at the end of this story, they are happy for now. Why does this matter? Why do we care that we have this definition of a central love story and an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending? And the main reason why, for our purposes, is reader expectation. When people come in and they're looking for a romance, they're looking for a specific experience. They know that the packaging can be anything. It could be the fluffiest, sweetest book. It can deal with things like sex trafficking and murder. But at the end, it will be a happily ever after based on that central love story. And so when people come in and they say, I want a romance, this is what they mean. So if you give them something that is not this, then we have not satisfied those reader expectations, and they will be disappointed, and sometimes angry. Disappointed, definitely, sometimes very, very angry. And that's with us, but also with authors. I will tell you that the very first romance conference I went to was in 2008, and I was shocked to learn that J.R. Ward, who is huge in the romance community, had written a book where one of her characters turns into a ghost at the end. There was still a happily ever after. They were still together. It's paranormal, obviously. So the ghost and the vampire actually were together at the end. Readers were furious. Readers were furious. And I sat and watched that woman take an hour of abuse from readers who were very angry that it, in their minds, did not have that optimistic ending. So people are pretty serious about their HEAs, and they want to make sure that it is there all the time. So if it isn't a romance, if it doesn't have a central love story and the happily ever after, you need both parts. What is it? Well, general fiction. General fiction does exist, and not everything has to belong to a genre. We tend to want to put everything into a category. So if that's you, general fiction is a great category, and we can put things in there and everybody will be happy. The funny thing, and why I have Romeo and Juliet here, is the actual title is The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, which should tell you it is not a romance. In case you didn't realize that you can't have, one or both partners dead at the end, the tragedy of is the clue that it is not a romance. Love stories are great. Tragic love stories are also great. But all romances are love stories. Not all love stories are romances. And if your love story ends with someone dead and the two or more partners not together, it is not a romance. Nicholas Sparks, I'm looking at you. So what about genre blends? Because again, we tend to categorize everything and we think it's either this or it's this. And in some cases, it's this and that. It's all of the things, but only a few things will fit on the spine of your book. So what do you do when you have something like Polaris Rising, which is equal parts science fiction and romance? Generally, if a choice has to be made, we in my library tend to look at what the media is doing. How are they, who is reviewing it? How are they reviewing it? What category are they putting it in? And who the publisher is. If your publisher is a science fiction publisher, we will tend to put it in science fiction. If it's not that clear, we'll just make our best guess and then keep moving and move on with life. Not everything is going to be 100% correct. But the key is also knowing in that science fiction book, there is a central love story that ends with a happily ever after. So when people will say to you that they're science fiction readers, but they want to try a romance, this would be the perfect book to give that person, because it's satisfying what they already like and also giving them what they're wanting to explore. But just know that romances can be hiding in many different genres. Sometimes the only definition is where we've decided to put it, since books cannot physically live in two places at once. So, about romance. These are the major subgenres. They're not all the subgenres. There are others. Dark romance is one that's relatively new. So new subgenres are being created all the time. I just realized I left Christian fiction or Christian romance off of here. So definitely not all of the romance subgenres, but these are the major ones that you will see. So historical. This one kind of makes me laugh because as we get older, we tend to think of historical as way, way in the past. But the date of demarcation between historical and contemporary keeps inching up. It was 1945, now it's 1950. And if you ask someone that was born in 2000, they may tell you that 1970s or 1980s is historical, which would break my heart, but they're not wrong. They're not wrong about that at all. Also, instead of just using a date, we also tend to think about how society has changed. So also historical, being able to walk someone to the gate at an airport. You can't really do that anymore. Using a corded phone, don't really see that anymore. I used to say using a phone booth, but I just saw one a couple weeks ago, so I can't use that anymore. So those things are also, to certain people, historical. It's not something that's going to feel familiar to a reader. They're not going to think of that as contemporary. But officially, according to RWA, 1950 is where we separate historical from contemporary. Although when we talk about historicals, we're usually talking way in the past, 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. And mostly a specific period called the Regency period in Britain. Historicals are mostly European, specifically Britain, but they also have Highlanders, you have Vikings, you have pirates. We're seeing a lot of 1920s or early turn of the century up through 1920s in America, and also some Civil War novels. So historical can be a great big category. Just know for the most part, it is British and Regency, but not always. And these are some examples of historical romances. All of these are either out now or very in the recent past, or I think his study in Scandal comes out next week. So pretty timely for your collections. A lot of them still use real people as models on the cover. The trend right now in contemporary is for the illustrated covers, like the Vanessa Riley book there on the end. But for historicals, there's still a lot that use actual people. The kind of debate between illustrated covers or model covers has been raging since illustrated covers became super popular, and it still rages. So it really is just preference. Some people like one, some like the other. I will say for the illustrated covers, it is very difficult to determine heat levels. They just look cute. They look cute, whether it's super spicy or whether it is closed door sex. You will never be able to tell from the cover if it's spicy or not. So keep that in mind as well. And these are 3 that do not take place in the UK. So really branching out what we think of as historical, who we think of as having a story that will fit a historical premise. And that's great because we all we all have history, and this telling it just from one point of view is never the best answer. So if people are looking for something outside of dukes and duchesses and earls, there are increasingly more to find. Contemporary, currently 1950 to present day. This is kind of the catch-all category for current romances. It's a very, very wide category. You have things that fit into other categories like romantic suspense, which we'll talk about in a second, or paranormals, which we'll also talk about. But for the most part, this is the big category of two people or more meeting in the current day and following that central love story through to the happily ever after. And like historicals, it's becoming more prevalent to see not just one man and one woman on their journey. So you're seeing a lot more lesbian romances, where LGBTQ romances used to always mean male-male, almost 95%. There were a few publishers that specifically did lesbian romance. And now you're seeing traditional publishers, big five publishers, coming along and picking up what others before them have done. Because now that they see people actually do want to read about something and someone else. The romantic agenda has an asexual hero, which you're not seeing that much of. And Can't Say Goodbye, that is 3 men having a romance. So it's not just a couple. It's not just one man and one woman. Everybody can find their happily ever after. Which is what absolutely we have been trying to get to. We're not 100% there yet. The numbers are still very heavily weighted towards traditional romance, but but everybody else is climbing. And as long as we offer books that don't just have, I should say, one white man and one white woman, because that's what it is as well. It's not just who, it's who in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality. We've been very, very staid for a long time. And so now with more writers writing from their own experience, we're seeing a boatload of different romances coming to the fore. And let me also just say, when you're recommending books to people, don't just recommend the white romances or the straight romances. Really look beyond who is on the cover or who is not on the cover, and recommend for plot or setting or any of the other tropes that we'll talk about in a second. That's the other key. It's partly getting things published, but it's also getting those published things into people's hands. Because if they publish, but they sit there, we discard them. And we say, oh, nobody wants those. Nobody wants romances with LGBTQ characters. Nobody wants romances with Black characters. Or we only have 5% Black population in our service area, so we're only going to buy, 1 out of every 15 Black romance because we don't have the population for that. You do have the population for that, because anybody can read a Black romance. Anybody can read an LGBTQ romance. Everybody, in fact. Anybody can read a romance with Latinx characters. It's the same story. And if you want that story, you want that story no matter who is at the center of it. So just keep that in mind. It's partly on publishers and authors and partly on us to recommend the books that they give us. So paranormal, the recognizable world, which is what separates it from fantasy. So in fantasy, you don't really recognize the world. Everything's different. There's a whole world building element that is not really familiar. Paranormal is the recognizable world. The streets, the towns, everything is as you would think it to be, with the addition of magic and or vampires, witches, werewolves, jinn, etc. Ghosts. Everybody is available for romance in the paranormal. It can also be historical or contemporary. So this is the first time I will say they're stackable. Subgenres are stackable. So you can have paranormal by gaslight, which is kind of the Victorian level of setting, or you can have right up to current day, where they're talking about cell phones and the internet. And these are some current paranormals. Nalini Singh is the undisputed queen of this genre. Others may name other people, but you're wrong. It is Nalini. She is the queen. The bitter medicine is kind of new, and people are really loving this title. And the Tessa Lily, also super popular, self-published. And so getting it can be a little tricky. I can't remember if this is one where it's not available in print and only through digital. There are a couple here that are that way, and I almost didn't put them in, but we do need to know what's popular, even if the library can't get it, because someone will come in and say, I want something like this. And you have to know what the this is so that you can match it with what you do have. So I do include things even if it's not available to libraries. There's always the hope as well that it will become available to libraries. Katie Robert lives here in Washington, so I often include her. She writes in several different subgenres. So she does paranormal, she does contemporary, she also does dark. So you might see her name several different times. Just be kind of careful on, she also writes erotic. So just be kind of careful on what Katie Robert you're getting or giving. One of my favorite titles from her is, I think it's like gifting me to his best friend. That's not something you probably want to give to someone under the age of 18. That's just me. Read freely, yes, but that is clearly erotic. And in this age of people complaining about everything, save yourself a little trouble and make sure that people know this is an erotic romance, and we're going, then let them do what they're going to do from there. But mark it so it's clear. Sacrifice is an erotic romance. It's an erotic vampire romance. It's also one that's in several parts. This is book 1. It's super popular and also super spicy, which you cannot tell from the cover because it looks just like someone walking in a really gothic dress, which is fantastic. Wow, is it spicy. Romantic suspense is the action adventure part of romance. So if there's guns on the cover, if your covers are dark and people are running, it's probably romantic suspense. It can be, again, contemporary or historical. In historical, they're less dark on the cover and more spies. So you'll see lots of spies. That's also romantic suspense. Action will ensue. The suspense part can range from, yeah, there's a hint in the background, kind of akin to a cozy mystery, where there's a threat, but you don't really see it on the page. You just hear about it, or you know it's there, it drives the plot, to, are you sure this is a romance? Because there's so much blood and there's so much gore. The action is on the page, the killing is on the page, the blood is on the page. So the range of romantic suspense can, lean kind of like mystery, where you have cozy and then you have hard-boiled. But the main romance rules still apply. Central love story, happily ever after. So Catch Me If You Can is kind of like the Patricia Highsmith book, The Talented Mr. Ripley. I knew it would come to me. So if you're looking for kind of that chase, or I don't really know who you are, and I think you're kind of suspect, but I love you anyway, that's this. It is one of the tried and true tropes of modern romance, modern action adventure too. People love this. You see it over and over again, and this is one example of that. Harbor by Rebecca Weatherspoon kind of looks like it is spicy, and it is. But if you're trying to gauge that just by a man's torso on the cover, you're not always going to get it right. So even though this has real people and it's not illustrated, it's kind of, you're taking your chances. Secret Service, also spicy. This is a subgenre that does not really use illustrated covers. You'll see sometimes, especially with witches. We just talked, or I was getting that confused with paranormal. Romantic suspense doesn't really use illustrated covers, and I should probably tag a yet on there, because the illustrated covers seem to be taking over, and not just romance. We're seeing them in general fiction a lot more too. So romantic suspense may be coming along with them, but I haven't really seen it yet, because it doesn't lend itself to danger. You like even with Into the Storm here, you're seeing the art lends itself to fright. So you're seeing that and you're thinking somebody's in distress, something bad is happening. The only reason why you would think it's going to end happily is because it's a romance. If that does not end happily, romance readers will be very angry, because they're taking it on faith that because it's romance, it's going to end the way they want it to, because the cover is giving them nothing. With Secret Service, you kind of guess, yeah, this is a romance. Yes, it's going to be about the president and the Secret Service. And I can guess that there's an HEA. With Into the Storm, it could be a thriller. The only way we know that it's not is because someone has told us it is not, which is why it's so important that we carry that forward to the reader and put things where they should be. in terms of the HEA. So if it's not romantic suspense, what is dark romance? These two are very close together, but there is a major difference. And the difference is dark romance isn't just about dark themes or danger, which is what a lot of people think it means. And they're like, well, why romantic suspense if, in dark, like, what's the difference? So the difference is the main characters in a dark romance are not always good people. They are anti-heroes. And they're sometimes often working in illegal occupations. So this is where your motorcycle club, think Sons of Anarchy, if you watched that, they weren't good people. They were the heroes of the story, but they were murderers. And they trafficked illegal guns and prostitution. Like, they were not good people. They were bad people. Assassins, a lot of mafia books, and not just mafia as we've come to know, but also Russian mafia, Irish mob. Every ethnicity has some sort of organized crime, and they have books. That is dark romance. Dark romance can also include situations of dubious consent, which is a hard limit for some people. So this is where following up on trigger warnings will help you a lot. And a lot of people who write in this subgenre will put those trigger warnings on the book or on their website. So if you have someone looking for a dark romance, it's good to ask questions. And a lot of people who read this will tell you right up front, I don't want dubious consent. I want mafia romance without dubious consent. I want mafia romance without, on the page murder. So this is very much a wild, wild west right now. There aren't any rules, which is what a lot of people like. But there are some hard limits, and we need to respect that patrons have those and help them when we can. All of that said, a dark romance is still a romance, and the romance rules apply. So central love story and happily ever after, even under some pretty extreme circumstances, kidnapping, what have you, everything that you can possibly think of probably has a dark romance correlation. Also, a subgenre of this subgenre, Klan and Black heroines, which for me, no thanks. But for some people, they really like having that redemption story, or what they feel is a redemption story. So again, dark romance. Just keep in mind, this is not for everyone. And I cannot stress that enough. We say that about everything. Not everybody likes historicals. Some people only like historicals. Not everybody wants to hear about witches and werewolves. Some people only want paranormals. This is truly not for everyone, but it's also super popular. Sunday, which was probably the first dark romance that I read, and it was before it had a category. This is one where inside the book, the hero thinks that after his first time with the heroine, that the police are going to come knocking on his door for rape. That is how close people can walk up to the line. So again, not for everyone. But it is super popular. We have people coming in looking specifically for dark romance. And we have to wonder, we have to ask, what exactly are you looking for? Because as you can see, it also runs the gamut. Not everything is a mafia romance. Sunday, for instance, is about two college students. Prince of the Brotherhood is a mafia romance, but it's also a there's some motorcycle element there, and Mafia Mistress is telling you right what it is. Also the first in the series. So just be careful with dark romance. It's super popular, so you're going to see it everywhere. And just know it takes people who want it, know what they want. People who want to experiment with it may not always know the intricacies. And that's where you have to kind of let them know that it's going to be a little bit different than a normal contemporary. I have not seen dark romance as a historical yet. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that I have not come across it. So it may eventually lean into historical. I have not seen that yet. But just let people know that if they want trigger warnings, they can find them, and help people have a good experience. So I didn't make a slide for erotic romance, I just realized. But let me talk about that for a second. It can be in any subgenre. So this is another one where it's stackable. You have it in historical, you have it in contemporary, you have it in paranormal. Almost all of the dark romances are also erotic. And it doesn't mean that it uses certain words, because almost all romances are using all the words now. Let's just put that out there. Regular romance is spicy. What people think of as spicy can vary. But romance, the heat level of romance has risen just from when I started doing collection development in 2001 to now. What you would call a general romance now would have been erotic back then. People, the genre has shifted and the center has shifted. So when we talk about erotic romance, what we mean is the sex in the romance is key to the story. And without the sex scenes, the story would fall apart. And if that's the case, that is an erotic romance. Luckily, it's labeled a lot, so you don't have to try to make that distinction, which would mean you have to read all the books so you could determine if that was the case. However, as you can see with covers, they're not going to be that helpful to you when you're trying to determine if something is erotic. And I hate to bring up 50 Shades of Grey, but on that cover was cufflinks. So that told you nothing. So just keep in mind that cover trends right now don't lean into describing what the content is. They lean into super cute. And that's wonderful, and they're very cute to look at, but they're not going to help you. So what are tropes? Story points, in a nutshell. Books can have focus on one or contain multiple. These are also stackable. These are selling points to patrons. People love tropes. A lot of other genres tend to shy away from them or think that they cheapen the book. Romance readers love tropes, and we search for them. Some people are looking specifically for one, or they're specifically trying to stay away from another. So when people come in and they say, I don't want any secret baby books, They don't want any secret baby books. That is exactly what they want. And so if you Google secret baby romance, the list that comes up, do not give those to your patron. Even if they have another trope that they might be interested in, let's say they want friends to lovers. This is a friends to lovers book. Friends to lovers book also has secret baby. They do not want that trope. And people use that to weed out stories that they don't want to read about. So tropes have a huge importance in the romance community. We embrace them wholeheartedly. And so if you're dealing with romance, so should you. So I'm going to go through just some of the traditional tropes and talk a little bit about them. Marriage of convenience used to be just historical, but contemporaries are now leaning into it. They have to find a different way to make the marriage of convenience happen. In historicals, you could say you're not going to get this property, or it was in someone's will. You can't really do that nowadays because that will be dismissed by the court. So you have to come up with other reasons for why it's a marriage of convenience. And so the people, it's usually more of a less of a they made me and more of a this helps both of us. And now with marriage equality, you're seeing a lot of same-sex marriage of convenience, which is not something that we saw before that was overturned. So, like I said, more people writing stories from their experience. Friends to lovers is probably one of the most popular tropes. Everybody likes when people who know each other or who have gone through a lot together, who never thought that it would turn out this way, actually turns out this way. Or when you're pining for your friend and you don't want to ruin the friendship, but it's still going to turn out this way. That's what we like. So again, it crosses all the subgenres. There's friends to lovers in every single subgenre, even in dark romance, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to something as soft and wonderful as friends to lovers, but even in dark romance, people love their friends to lovers. Enemies to lovers is probably my favorite trope, and one that you will see a lot in dark romance. We hate each other. There's no reason for me to ever think that it would become something else, except for it does. Sometimes it's not hate, sometimes it's rivalry. So this is also a trope that has a wide range. Sometimes it's Hatfield and McCoy's level of hatred. Families hate each other for generations, and the two shall never meet. And sometimes it's just we're both vying for a job, or we're both trying to get something and only one of us can have it, and that makes us rivals. So reading the back will tell you which one it is, but sometimes people think enemies to lovers is only the most extreme, and that's not it. And so they're disappointed because they want those extreme emotions, and it's more of the rivalry version. So just be aware that this is one where it could mean a lot of things, but they are somehow antagonistic to each other. And at the end, they end up together. Second chance, and this is also second chance, lovers to enemies to lovers. So it's one where they were together in high school, and something happened to break them apart and cause them to be enemies for a good amount of years until something else happens that causes them to have a second chance. So this is one with stackable tropes, and it's also a indie book, although I know for a fact that this one is available in print, so you can add it to your libraries. But if you're doing a list, RA list on tropes, this one would fit on a couple different lists. Secret baby, probably the most hated trope in all of romance. It is very polarizing. There are people who absolutely hate it. There are people who absolutely love it. Both sides have good arguments. But the key here is you're not going to change anybody's mind. They hate it for a reason, or they love it for a reason. And they know the arguments from both sides, and they don't care. And that's great. We should never try to force people to, oh, but you'll love this secret baby. No, I won't. I won't. It's a trope I don't like. I don't want it. Let's move on. Forced proximity. Also called Only One Bed, which was more of a plot point that has morphed into a trope as people started looking for it. Oh, I want a story where there's only one bed. And you started hearing that more and more often. And now people are marking that as a trope because they know that people are looking for it, and that will help lead people to their books. This is forced proximity, where they both, to keep their job or get the thing that they want, they have to work together. But it turns out he was the best man that caused her not to marry her groom. You see her pushing him right off the cake. Fantastic book, a lot of fun. A rom-com before we started labeling everything rom-coms, and forced proximity. Fake dating is also super popular. Also fake marriage. So this is another one that runs the gamut from I'm gonna pretend you're my boyfriend to I'm gonna pretend you're my husband. And again, reading the back will tell you this is an LGBTQ title. Lauren Blakely has written roughly a zillion books. She's self-published, and all of her books are available in print, and I think on Overdrive as audio, but I do not believe they are available, or not, they're not all available. A few may be available as ebooks, but it's one where you really have to search to see which ones will be available and which ones are not. But she has a trope. She has a book in almost every trope. I believe all of them are contemporary. I don't believe she's written historicals. But if you're looking for a place to start, if you don't know where to start with contemporary, this is a good place, because you will find something literally for everyone written by her. So coming to the end, what are some trends that we're seeing right now? One is fantasy romance. And we talked a little bit about the difference between that and paranormal. So fantasy is going to include things like dragons, and it's going to be set in a world that does not look like the world we inhabit. It's just like regular fantasy novels, except for it's going to have those two magic characteristics, a central love story and a happily ever after. This is having a huge moment right now. It's always existed. Think of El Penelope, who started the trend, the resurgence of the trend, probably about 5 to 7 years ago. But it's always been there. You just haven't really seen a lot of it And now, again, like with lesbian romance, big publishers are picking it up. And so you're seeing a lot of big five pushing fantasy romance, where before it was mostly in indie romance. What happens is indie romance sells a bunch, and then trad pubs like, we like money, we should pick some up, and there you go. Also, YA is huge for fantasy romance, huge. And also, we like money. So now you're seeing adult romance come along and add fantasy romance. So don't be surprised if you start seeing a lot more of it. The other hot trend right now is what some call why choose romance, otherwise known by the terrible term of reverse harem. And I could lecture all day about why no one should ever use that term, aside from the fact that it's terribly racist. It doesn't make sense. Because if you're the kind of person who thinks a harem is, oh, a man gets to have sex with all these women, which is not what a harem is, the reverse of that would be a man's having sex with no woman, which is not what reverse harem is. So the why choose romance is polyamory, basically. It's polyamorous relationships, polyamorous romances. The term reverse harem, much like the term reverse racism, doesn't make a bit of sense. But if you want to find poly romances, you will have to use that term. More and more people are starting to pick up the why choose romance. Poly romances, I've seen maybe once or twice. You don't see it very often, even though the term is right there and can be used. Reverse harem is a term that's stuck, and again, started in indie romance and now being picked up by more traditional romances, although this one is a lot slower to be adopted by trad pub. So you're still not seeing a lot of big five publishers coming out with poly romances, but it's on the horizon. And that is it for me.
Robin, that was fantastic. And I see that I'm going to pin myself really quick. We have a great question from Kelly specifically about erotic and dark romances. She is curious how much of this information can be communicated in a catalog record, or is it mostly learning from outside sources, such as review outlets, etc.?
I think that depends on what the book has put in its metadata. So if they have put like trigger warnings or something like that in the metadata, then you can put that into your catalog. If you go to the author's website and they have it there, then I guess you can decide if that's something you want to include in your catalog, but it'll probably be a manual ad. It's not something that's going to come with the metadata. But as to whether you want to, it might be good to know. A lot of people also put full descriptions of whatever is on the back cover on their book, and sometimes those warnings are in that full description. So that would be another way that it would get into your catalog.
Great, thank you. That was so helpful too. And I see Ruben has three great questions. The first is, do you have any recommendations for romance novels featuring disabled characters? I'm also personally interested. So if you have recommendations, that would be great. They also ask, would you classify a novel that features heavy but clearly consensual kink/BDSM as dark romance? And lastly, do you think the rising popularity, accessibility of fan fiction has contributed to the tropiness of romance novels? So three separate good questions.
Yes, so the romances featuring disabled characters, I do have a couple, but off the top of my head, I don't want to get the titles wrong. So I would need to look those up because I don't want to miss the titles. I know one is by Serena Bowen and the other one is by Ramsey Hoopman. I think that one is called Courting Greta. That one I do know. The one by Serena, I do not know the title right off the top of my head. So I will send those to Stephanie and she can disseminate those. Heavy but clearly consensual kink. No, not a dark romance, because dark romance is less about that and more about the amoralness of the characters. And so if the consensual kink BDSM involves assassins, then yes, that would be a dark romance. But if it's just ordinary people minding their business, no. And romance has always been tropey. And so I don't think that the accessibility of fan fiction has contributed to that. I would say it might be the other way around. Like the tropiness of fan fiction comes from romance because it has always been this way. And a lot of people who are writing fan fiction also write romance.
Those are excellent answers. Thank you. And I'm happy to send the recommendations for novels, romance novels featuring disabled characters to everyone afterwards. Kayla also has a great question. Do you feel that romance novels should be purchased more electronically or physical in print or a combination?
I think a combination, and I have morphed into a dedicated digital reader, but not everyone has access to being able to read digitally or desire. It's not just that they can't, they don't want to, and they shouldn't have to, as long as print materials exist. So while I personally read probably 99% digitally, I think it should be a combo of both, just so that you're not missing accessibility for some people.
Right, that's also a great answer. Thank you. And this is a question from earlier. How do you feel about cliffhangers and multi-part romance series? So do you have a personal preference?
I don't, because I read them and I'm right there in line for the next installment. So while I wish that they didn't happen, I still eat them up. So I can't really say I don't like them because clearly I do. I think it's clear. I think it's best to be clear up front. I will say I don't like the surprise. So if you think that something is going to end and it doesn't end, I don't like that. I think you should be clear up front. This is going to be a story in 3 parts, or this is going to be a story with a cliffhanger. A lot of books will tell you that now in their descriptions, or on author websites, they will tell you this book ends in a cliffhanger. You know that before you put that book up for sale. So I think that you should tell people so they know what to expect.
Okay, great. And Karen has a follow-up asking if you feel that that damages the HEA requirements if there is a cliffhanger.
I don't think it damages it if you know up front. I think it damages it if you don't know. And so it doesn't end happily. But if you know this book is going to, like the Sylvia Day series is across 5 books, that is clearly a romance, but it's across 5 books. And you need to know that up front so that you know at the end of the series, they're going to be together. At the end of book 2 or 3 or whatever, they're not together. And you need to understand that's not the end. That's the end of the book, but that's not the end of the story. So I guess I would say the HEA requirement is the end of the story. Sometimes that story is contained in one book, sometimes it is not. But that's why you have to let people know what the expectation is.
Great, thank you. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. But I think we're wrapping up. So thank you, Robin. And thank you everyone for staying over time with us too for a few minutes. This was so informative, fantastic, super helpful. I can share the slides with everyone afterwards and any recommendations and the recording. So thank you again, Robin, for your expertise. We were so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you guys for staying.